He said, how could he feel resentful?
No one could have talked to these killers like that.
That was the kind of sense of humor that Mandela had.
6 New York Times correspondents reflect on their interactions and experiences covering Nelson Mandela.
I watched Nelson Mandela get off a plane in 2000 in Arusha, Tanzania. He was there to broker peace in Burundi, which had been at war for quite some time. It was a terrible war. 200,000 people were killed. I had been very excited to see him. I had always admired him, but what I saw was a little disappointing. I mean, to me, he was 81 then. He was, really showing his age. He seemed to sort of weak and tired. When he asked questions, they weren't very sharp. I thought to myself, I wish I'd seen him before. Then he went into the convention room and sat in front of these very same people who had killed these 200,000 people. And he lectured them like they were school children. The atmosphere suddenly changed to absolute electricity. I don't want to get this wrong, so I brought what he said. He asked how these men could justify to the outside world such slaughter. He said, when they hear this, they say Africans are still barbarians. No human beings could do what they are doing. Please join the modern world. It's hard to overstate the power of these words. I mean, no one could have talked to these killers like that. Nobody in the entire world, I think. And he got away with it, and some of them even said they felt bad to be scolded by Mandela. That night, I called my wife. My wife was pregnant, and I said, I think I have a name for our child. And it's Nelson, and he's 12 now. Hi, Nelson. Any thoughts about your name?
Well, to me, my name is just my name, but as I got older, I realized what he really did and how he was in jail for 27 years just to prove a point. And I think it was really amazing because he could have come out of jail and really done anything. He could have had his revenge on the people that disrespected him and Africans, but he didn't, which is really amazing. So I'm really lucky that I'm named after such a hero.
He met the world's press for the first time in one of the most beautiful gardens in South Africa, in the Archbishop of Cape Town's house, Bishop Tutu. And there were 1,000 journalists there from all over the world. Mandela seated himself beneath a quinine tree at a table and took questions. The first question that really made an impact on me was, do you feel resentful towards the white people of South Africa for the 27 lost years? And how did he respond to that? He said, how could he feel resentful when his best friend during his years of imprisonment was a white warder, whom he named, who had been his friend throughout his time in prison, who had refused promotion and stayed with him, who eventually stood behind him at his swearing in. And he said, this man, for me, represented the best of white South Africa. So how could I feel resentful? That was followed by an extraordinary moment when he was taking questions, when a man with a heavily Afrikaans accent asked a question and identified himself as the chief correspondent of the South African Broadcasting Corporation Afrikaans Language Service, one of the voices of apartheid. And this man asked Mandela a question. Mandela said, Johan, addressing him by his first name, he said, I've been longing to meet you. He said, I only had a radio for my last years in prison. You have been for me the voice of South Africa. You are the one on whom I relied to learn what was going on in my native country. You did a wonderful job. You reported very fairly. And I want to thank you for that. Shook Johan's hand. Johan, who had been shaking, burst into tears.
So I was in the Johannesburg Bureau as the #2 correspondent from 1995 to 1999 when Nelson Mandela was president. And I never actually met Nelson Mandela because that was the bureau chief's job. But towards the end of my stint there, he gave a speech at the Foreign Correspondents Association. And normally I don't go buddy up to important people, but I thought people were getting in line to meet him, and I thought, oh, come on, Donald, don't be such a prig. This is Nelson Mandela. It's Madiba. He's a living saint. He's 80 years old. How much longer is he going to be here? go up and shake his hand. So I got in line with everybody else, and Mandela starts to come down the line, and he's shaking hands, and I'm trying to think of something to say, and he gets to the person just to my right, and then he turns to face me, and then he glances up over my shoulder, and he just glides right past me and takes a hand of the person next to me, and you can hear him say, "You must be a basketball player." And I turn, and there's this stunningly beautiful 6'2" woman in her high heels standing next to me, and Mandela has just blown right past me, and he's holding her hand, and she starts to giggle and say, "Oh no, Mr. Mr. President, I don't play basketball." I said, "Oh, but you are an athlete, aren't you?" And she said, "Well, I swim." "A swimmer? Oh, that's wonderful." And I thought, well, you unrepentant old hound dog. You know, here you are, 80 years old, and still at it. And so I never got to meet Nelson Mandela, although I got to see his charm up close.
The first time that I met Nelson Mandela in person, I was going to his house to meet with him late at night with the executive editor of the New York Times, who was visiting South Africa. And we pulled up in front of this house, which was a very ordinary looking house in the suburbs outside of Johannesburg, and there wasn't even a lot of security. I think there was one guy standing in the driveway, and I remember being shocked by that. And we walked up to the front door, and some young woman ushered us in. Everything was very dark. You did get the sense that he was alone in that house, and that in fact might be a very lonely life that Nelson Mandela had. But anyways, he eventually comes down, and we have tea. We're sitting in the living room, and he's talking to Joe, and I have to say I was in awe. It was kind of hard to figure out what I was supposed to do, and the two men talked for a while, and Nelson Mandela never looked at me, and it was a little formal and stiff, and then at a certain point he gets this sort of sly smile on his face because he had an incredible sense of humor, and he leans over to Joe and he says to him, looking at me, he says, "In my day, a man would be embarrassed to have a wife who looked like that. And in my day, a man's wife needed a little more meat on her bones." And that was the kind of sense of humor that Mandela had. He was a little bit of a tease. I remember at one point he got very angry at an opposition politician, and he called him, he said he had a Mickey Mouse operation. And the opposition politician got very angry, and he said Mandela was goofy. If he was Mickey Mouse, then Mandela was goofy. And a couple of weeks later, Mandela was in the hospital for some kind of test, and the politician was in the hospital for a heart problem. And so Mandela went to meet him, and he comes around the curtain in the hospital room, and he says, "Mickey Mouse, it's goofy." So he had a very good sense of humor.
My family moved to Kenya in 1980 when I was 4 years old. My mother is from Ethiopia, and my father is from the United States, from Minnesota. At my elementary school in Nairobi, there were lots of other kids like me, cross-cultural relationships, every shade of black, brown, yellow, what have you. And in school, we learned that there was this country called South Africa, and they had a system called apartheid. And families like ours were forbidden. We weren't allowed to live together. We weren't allowed to be together. Our parents would not be allowed to marry. But we also learned that there was a man named Nelson Mandela who was sitting in a prison in South Africa for fighting against this system. And his dream was to create a country where families like ours could be together, and people of all races could live in harmony. When I moved to South Africa at the end of 2011 to be the bureau chief in Johannesburg, I was surprised and delighted to find that now there are many families like mine, black, white, Indian, and it literally is a rainbow nation now. People do marry whoever they want. Of course, the legacy of long racial separation is not something that's erased overnight or even in 20 years, but Nelson Mandela's vision of a non-racial South Africa is on display in shopping malls, in wedding chapels, in schoolyards, everywhere you go. And I think that's going to be a lasting legacy for this country that suffered under a really brutal system of racial separation, that today people can be together no matter who they are.
Mandela was not heard. He was invisible to anybody except his closest family, and they could relay messages back. One fascinating aspect of that period was that the government was desperate to diffuse the power that he had. They wanted him out of prison. They didn't want him to be an emblem or a symbol. They wanted him to renounce violence. They wanted him to go into some kind of strange residential arrangement whereby he'd live in one of the so-called homelands, and he consistently said no. And I remember one occasion particularly, early 1985, in the Jabulani Stadium in Soweto, 9,000 people, and they were waiting for word from Zinzi Mandela, one of the daughters who'd just come back from visiting, and she told them that her father had made very clear to her in their conversations that his freedom and theirs could not be separated. He wouldn't accept his freedom until his people were also free in a democratic society.